At this point, we've covered a lot of ground with React context. And while context is mostly used for passing global state to deeply nested components that need it, the process of centralizing that data can actually greatly simplify components by isolating and encapsulating related logic. So let's see some slightly more intricate usage of context when dealing with posts. Now, in our case, this might not be the best use of context, but it'll illustrate a really good teaching moment, at least, for how we can leverage context to do a number of different things. So let's add another context to our application. In this case, we have our auth context. Let's create a new one. Let's touch source contexts, and let's call this one posts.js. Now, by adding a new context here, which we're going to do, and again, before I start writing any of this code, I just want to kind of illustrate my general thinking here. In our previous context, our auth context, the main purpose of this was to centralize user applications, or user state, excuse me. And this global user state is then passed around to any part of our application that needs it. Now, in doing so, we also had a few other things that we centralize within the auth context provider, including this useEffect hook, which is used to fetch the active user in whether or not they're logged in based on the token in local storage, and also to provide this handle logout function so that anything that needs to have a place for users can log out will also have access to that. Now, we could have put a bunch of stuff here. We really could have put the login function. We could have put the handle on on registration function. We could have put all of that inside our auth context provider, but at the moment our use login form and use registration form hooks work just fine. For the posts, however, it might make sense to include a bunch of post related information here. So before I do anything here, I want you to take a minute and try to do this one yourself. All I want you to do is create a new context object called posts context, and then define a post context provider component along with a use posts context custom hook. And so just do the import necessary imports here, and then go ahead and create the context, create the provider, and create the custom hook. And so just go ahead and do that in the same general pattern as our auth context. And then I want you to think about what logic or data we might want to centralize inside this provider component. So go ahead and take a few seconds, pause this video now, and try it out yourself before coming back to see how we do it. Okay, you ready? Hopefully you've had a second now. You've gone through this, you paused it. If you didn't, again, I truly recommend, do this yourself at least once before seeing how we do it, just so you get the feel for because a lot of times when I do that, at least I realize what I didn't remember from how to actually create it. And so only by doing it a number of times does it become muscle memory. So great, let's get this going. The first thing we need to do is the necessary imports for context look like this. We import create context and use context, and we probably need use state also from React since we're going to initialize some state here. And then we need to create the context object. So we're going to say const posts context equals create context, and we're going to give it a default value of null since we don't care. Then the posts context provider. We're going to export a const post context posts context. I could have chosen a totally better word there, but whatever. And then posts, because that's so much harder to say a million times. Provider that takes in some children, and then it returns a function that has some state. And let's store all of the posts here. And let's also have the posts handler, and we'll say use state, be an empty array. And then we'll also have the is fetching prop here, and we'll set is fetching equal to use state false. Then let's have error set error equal to use state null. Then we will create a posts value object that has the posts, set posts is fetching, set is fetching, error, set error. And this is actually a good illustration of something that probably doesn't make a ton of sense. If we're going to be fetching posts a lot and this is constantly changing, we probably wouldn't want to keep this in context because, again, that re-rendering issue starts to rear its ugly head. But considering that we're only really fetching posts at the very beginning of when the app is initialized, it's probably not a huge issue here. Then all we're going to do is we're going to return the posts context dot provider. And it's going to have some value, which is the posts value, or post values, whatever I called it. And it is going to return or render just some children inside it. And once we've done that, then we just export our custom hook so that anyone that, or any component that wants to use this value can consume it. So we'll say export const use posts context equals a function that returns the results of the use context hook on the posts context. Cool. Now, just like before, again, I want you to think about this, how we did this last time. In the app component here, we created this new app container component and we wrapped the whole app in the provider. We can do that exact same thing here, except this time we are using the posts context provider. So instead of the auth context provider, we have the posts context provider from contexts, from posts. Just so many X's and S's, it's hard to say. Posts, contexts. So I apologize if that's hard to understand. And then we just take that provider and we wrap the app again. Now, this is what you do when you have multiple providers wrapping the same thing, is you just nest them inside each other. And you don't have to worry about it. It's not super important. It doesn't change things much. Just understand that that's all we're doing here. And again, this is starting to look a little more interesting because the more context we add, the more providers that we need to wrap the app with. And in general, I like to keep my usage of context pretty light, as like it can get kind of absurd if we just have like a bunch of these just nested, and then the app in the middle. There's better ways to do that. And so when you see yourself doing that, it might be time to step back and say, like, does this all really need to be global state? And most of the time the answer is no. You only need a few things in global state in almost any application. And if you are reaching for global state a lot, it might be time to think about a more powerful solution to that, which is a discussion for a later time. Now, looking at our app.js file, we can see that we have a few things going on here. We have this fetch posts effect here that fetches posts as soon as the application mounts to the screen. Now, looking at that, I mean, like, why don't we move that into our new contexts? In fact, why don't we move all of these handlers into our context, since they're all related to the global posts array that we need, since this is all being handled there. Ta-da! And this is also all part of our posts thing. Let's take this and let's put it right in here. I don't like using the word thing there. I should have been more descriptive, but so be it. Bam. And then let's also add the add post and update post to our posts value. Add post, update post. Cool. And let's also import use effect here, since we are using effect. And let's make sure we also grab our API client. Just like so. And with that, we can save this. And let's check out our application. Seems to still be working at the moment. But before we check out anything else out, let's go back to our app really quickly and notice that we have a bunch of errors now. So all of these props that are meant to be passed are no longer being passed. And so we're going to have to make sure our home and post detail components still get all the values they need from the appropriate contexts. So let's go to home really quickly. Open up your home component and just check out what it is here we actually need. Well, this component relies on the error, is fetching, and the posts themselves. So home actually does need access to these because it's using them in its rendering. So let's go ahead and import the use posts context from contexts posts. And then here, we will say const is fetching posts error equals use posts context. Cool. Now, we don't need is fetching as a prop anymore. We don't need post as a prop anymore. And we don't need error as a prop anymore. Now, we could just import add post here and then just pass it directly to our new post form. But why? When you can just use the use post context again in the new post form and not have to worry about passing those props at all. So let's get rid of that. And let's get rid of that. And there we go. Now, go ahead and update the new post form as well. So add a new post form and do the same thing. Let's import the use posts context from contexts posts. Then here, instead of accepting add post as a prop, we will say const add post is equal to use posts context. And because this context is storing all of the posts in state here, passing around these updater functions is actually really simple. And so we can pass these updater functions at any nesting level throughout our application, and it makes it really easy to access those values without having to worry about passing them down the component hierarchy and drilling and doing the prop drilling and all that fancy goodness. And so with that out of the way, we actually have most of that handled. And if we look at our home component now no longer needs to be passed any props, and things should work as expected. So if we go into our app, we can actually get rid of all of this right here. Ta-da! And now home should be pretty happy, but we still have a few issues here. And I think it's also important to take a look at this new post form. We're looking at a pretty substantial block of logic for this component. It might be time to think about extracting this into a custom hook. But before we do that, actually, you know what? No, let's go do that right now. This is a little bit long of a video, but it's fine. Let's go ahead and take all of this and create a new post form hook. Or let's call it use new post form. So in here, we'll go back in, we'll say touch source hooks use new post form.js. And in that use new post form hook, we're going to do the exact same thing we've done every time before and throw all of that logic directly in there. And again, this time, give yourself a shot. Try it out. Pause the video. Try to do this one entirely on your own. You should be super comfortable with them at some point, but might not be now, but give it a shot. Come back to this, and as soon as you're done, I'll show you how we did it. Okay, you ready? Let's get it done. Now, first things first, let's just go ahead and import all of those imports there. We're probably going to delete most of them, which is fine. We won't need any components, that's for sure. And we probably won't need our auth context either. But we will need to import or export a const use new post form. And that should extract the add post from use, or actually, you know what? Let's, instead of just typing this all out, again, let's do this. Let's grab everything here and let's copy it and let's move it directly into here. Okay, looks good. Doesn't look like we're missing anything. And now let's also make sure we expose the appropriate data. So let's expose the form, the errors, the is loading flag, the handle on input change, and handle on submit state. Okay, looks good. Let's come in here, and since those are no longer there, we no longer need to import the context here. We don't need our API client. We don't need our use state. We're simply just getting the user from the auth context and then rendering things as needed. All we need now is just our custom hook, which is the use new post form from hooks use new post form. And we can say const form error is loading handle on input change handle on submit equals use new post form. Ta-da! And that's it. So just for good measure, let's make sure this works. Looks like there's a number of places where I have not fixed this. Let's make sure the home. I guess I got to save a few of these components. Cannot destructure add post of object. It is null. Is fetching. Oh, maybe I did not save the use post context. Looks like I did here. Okay. So this looks right. Use post context. Cool. That looks good too. Must have had an error somewhere. Let's see where I put it. Ah, I know. It's that we haven't saved our application, which has an error. So let's actually remove this just so that it's no longer erroring out. Let's save this. And hopefully now that is fixed. Ah, yeah, cool. Now, that's actually a really good point, though. If we don't wrap this post context provider around the app, we'll get this interesting error that we saw here, which is that cannot destructure property is fetching of object as it is null. And so this use post context custom hook does not work because it cannot find the context value because there's no provider wrapping our app. And so you will see that error pop up if you do not wrap the application or whatever the component is that is trying to consume the provider or consume the context with the context provider. So that's a really good example right there. Now we've saved our application, but we're going to need to update our post detail in the next video. But for now, let's get rid of all of this fluff from the app and make sure we can still create a form here. So let's log in as Kermit the Frog. Oh, let's do Miss Piggy this time. Miss Piggy. Let's log in. Okay, sounds good. Piggy's set up. And the image URL will be, hopefully I have one saved. This might not be one. It's the gummy bears again. Cool, and it worked just the same. So nothing's changed, everything looks great, and we're good to go. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and save our work. Git status, git add, git commit, added, posts context to application. And let's wrap this up.